My name is Vera Langston, and I'm 78 years old. I've lived long enough to bury my parents, my husband, 3 siblings, and most of my friends. But nothing, not war, not loss, not all those funerals, prepared me for the moment my granddaughter sat across from me and said the words I'd been running from for 60 years. It was a rainy Thursday in late September, the kind where the clouds hung low and the air felt like it was pressing on your shoulders. We were sitting at my kitchen table, the one I bought back in 1968 with the money from my first real paycheck. The smell of the cornbread I'd just pulled from the oven still lingered, and the hum of the old refrigerator filled the silence between us. Her name is Maddie, 20 years old, with soft brown eyes that looked far older than they should. She was holding her mug with both hands, but I could see the way her fingers trembled. "Grandma," she said quietly, her voice thin but steady, "something happened to me a while back. I didn't want to tell anyone, but I think I have to now. I should have braced myself. I should have been ready for anything." But when she spoke the next words, the room shifted under me. "It was Uncle Greg," she whispered. I don't know what I looked like in that moment, but I know what I felt. My stomach clenching so tight it hurt, my hands gripping the table as if I might float away if I didn't hold on. Her Uncle Greg, my son. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the phone, call the police, run out into the rain and never come back. But my voice betrayed me. All I could manage was a choked, "What do you mean, Maddie?" And then she told me. She told me about the night she stayed at Greg's house because her mother, my daughter-in-law, was out of town. She told me how he came into the room after she'd gone to bed, how he sat on the edge of the mattress and started talking softly, like he was just checking in. She told me how it turned into something else, something wrong, something she couldn't stop. Her words hit me like stones, one after the other, relentless. And with every one, I could feel myself sliding back into a place I had sealed off so long ago I sometimes convinced myself it never existed. Because my first kiss wasn't from a boy I loved. It wasn't under a high school football stadium or in the back of a car after prom. It was stolen in the dark by a man who shared my last name. I was 18 when it happened, but in a way I was still a child. I didn't even understand that it was wrong until later. Not because it didn't feel wrong, but because in my family, there was no such thing as wrong when it came from certain people. There was only silence. And that silence was enforced by smiles at church, polite small talk at barbecues, and 100 "don't you dare" looks from the women who should have protected me. And now, 60 years later, I was looking at my granddaughter, knowing she had been forced into the same silence. She was crying now, her tears dripping into her tea. "I didn't want to tell you, Grandma, because I didn't want to ruin things between you and Uncle." "Ruin things." My voice cracked. "Sweetheart, he ruined everything the moment he touched you." I didn't tell her then, but in that moment, something ancient and buried inside me cracked open. I had spent decades pretending my secret didn't matter anymore. I convinced myself I had survived, that survival was enough. I told myself I was too old to dig up the past, too tired to fight battles I should have fought when I was young. But seeing Maddie's face, it was like watching my own reflection 60 years ago, begging for someone to see me, to save me. And I realized I couldn't stay silent this time. Not for her. Not for me. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. My skin was thin and lined, hers smooth and young, but we were bound by the same wound. "Maddie," I said, my voice low but fierce, "you don't know the whole story. And when you do, you'll understand why I can't let this go. Not this time. Not ever again." Her eyes widened, but before she could ask, the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID. Greg. And that's where I knew. This wasn't going to be another secret we swallowed. This was going to be the thing that tore the whole facade apart. Picked up the receiver. Mom. His voice was casual, almost cheerful. Hey, I was thinking about stopping by later. Greg, I cut in, my voice sharp enough to slice the air. Don't you dare step foot in my house until you're ready to hear the truth you've spent your life hiding from. There was a pause. Small loaded pause. And then he said, "What truth?" I looked at Maddie, her tear-streaked face staring back at me. "The one that's going to end you," I said and hung up. I could feel Maddie watching me, her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, Grandma?" she asked. I pushed back my chair and stood, my knees aching but my resolve stronger than it had ever been. "It's time I told you everything," I said. "But once you know, there's no going back." She swallowed hard. "I want to know." And as I walked to the hallway closet to pull down the old, dust-covered box from the top shelf, the one I'd sworn I'd never open again, I realized this was no longer just my story. This was our war. If you were sitting across from me right now, would you tell me to stay quiet? Or would you tell me to burn it all down? Because that's exactly what's coming next. If you're ready to hear what's inside that box, like this video, leave a comment, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. The box was heavier than I remembered. Not in weight. Lord knows it was mostly just paper and photographs, but in the way it seemed to pull at my arms like it carried every secret I'd ever buried. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it down between Maddie and me. She didn't reach for it. She just stared, her lips pressed into a tight line, as if she already knew whatever was inside was going to hurt. The cardboard was frayed at the edges, the tape yellowed and brittle. My hands shook as I peeled it back. I'd sealed this box up in 1964, 2 weeks after I left my parents' house for good. I told myself I'd never open it, never look at those memories again. And I'd kept that promise for almost 60 years. Until tonight. The first thing I pulled out was a stack of black and white photographs, edges curling from age. Maddie leaned in, her hair brushing the side of my arm. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing to a girl in a gingham dress with a shy smile. "That's me," I said quietly. She blinked. "You look so young." "I was 17 there," I said. "That was the summer before everything changed." I didn't mean to sink into the memory so quickly, but the photograph was like a doorway, and before I could stop myself I was back there. It was July 1959, and the air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle. Our house sat on 3 acres of land just outside the small town of Oak Hollow, Georgia. My father worked the railroad, my mother kept the home, and I dreamed about leaving. We weren't poor, but we weren't the sort of family that let money go to lipstick or new dresses. My hair was always pulled back in a plain braid, my shoes scuffed from hand-me-down wear. I didn't mind. I thought the whole world was waiting for me. Then he came to live with us. Vera Langston, my father's nephew, was 24, fresh out of the army, with a sly smile and a way of looking at people like he could read their thoughts. He needed a place to get back on his feet, my father said. My mother called it helping family. First I thought he was exciting. He talked about cities I'd never been to, wars I'd only read about in the paper. He'd sit on the porch with me at night, flicking his cigarette ash into the dark, telling me about how the real world works. I didn't know those late-night talks were just the warm-up. One night in early August, I woke to the sound of the floor creaking. I thought it was my mother going to the bathroom. But then the shadow stopped at my doorway. I remember the smell first. Cigarettes and something sharp, whiskey maybe. And then his voice. "You still awake, Vera?" I was frozen. My heart beat so loud I thought he'd hear it. He sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. His hand rested on my knee over the blanket. "You're real pretty, you know that," he said. I wish I could say I screamed or told him to get out. But I didn't. I just lay there, a rabbit caught in the snare. Then he leaned down and kissed me. My first kiss. Not with a boy I liked. Not in the sweet, clumsy way I'd imagined. It was heavy, wrong, his breath hot and bitter. When he pulled back, he smiled like it was a secret we shared. "Don't tell your folks," he said. "They wouldn't understand." I didn't tell. Not that night, not the next day, not for decades. Because in our house, secrets like that weren't accidents, they were traditions. And when I did try to tell my mother a few weeks later, she shut me down before I could even finish. "Don't start trouble, Vera," she'd said, her eyes sharp as glass. "You're not a little girl anymore. You know how to handle yourself." Handle myself. Those words stuck with me like a splinter under my skin. Back in the kitchen, Maddie was staring at me wide-eyed. "Grandma," she whispered, "are you saying what happened to me happened to you too?" I nodded slowly. Yes. But in my day, no one wanted to hear it. No one wanted to believe it. So I learned to live with it. She shook her head. How could they ignore that? How could they act like it was nothing? Because admitting it meant tearing down the image they wanted to keep, I said. And people will do awful things to protect an image. I pulled more from the box. Letters, ticket stubs, a pressed flower from the first dance I went to after leaving home. And at the very bottom, a thin scrapbook. "This," I said, sliding it toward her, "is proof that you and we are not liars. And when the time comes, this is what we're going to use to make them listen." She opened it carefully, flipping past pages of photographs and clippings until she stopped at one, a faded Polaroid of Warren and me, taken the summer before I left. His arm was slung around my shoulders, my smile tight and wrong. Maddie traced the photo with her finger. "What happened to him?" I let out a humorless laugh. "He got married, had kids, moved away, died 20 years ago. And everyone acted like he was a good man right up to the end. Then how are we supposed to?" She trailed off, her eyes darting toward the living room, where the sound of the rain outside grew louder. "How are we supposed to take down someone who's still alive?" And I knew she meant Greg. I closed the scrapbook and met her gaze. "We're going to use the same weapon they used against us. Family reputation. Only this time, we're the ones holding the matches." Her mouth fell open slightly. "You mean?" "I mean we're not just telling the truth," I said. "We're going to make sure it burns down everything they've built on our silence." We sat there in silence for a long moment, listening to the rain. My mind was already moving ahead, forming a plan. But before I could speak it aloud, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. Car had pulled into my driveway. Maddie's eyes widened. "Is that?" I stood up and moved to the window. It was Greg. And he was getting out of his car, holding something in his hand. They thought the past was buried. They thought we'd stay quiet forever. But the second Greg walked up my driveway that night, I knew the reckoning had begun. The knock was too polite. That was the first thing I noticed. Greg never knocked politely. He pounded like the world owed him attention. But tonight it was 3 neat taps, measured and controlled, like he'd rehearsed them in the car. Maddie froze halfway to the hallway. "Do you want me to?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll answer." I opened the door to find him standing there in a neatly pressed shirt, his hair still damp from the rain. He was holding a folder, the corners bent as if he'd been gripping it too tightly. "Mom," he said, his tone soft, almost conciliatory. "Can we talk?" "I'm listening," I said, but didn't move aside to let him in. He shifted the folder under his arm. "It's cold out here. Can I come in?" "You've stood on this porch in worse weather," I said. His eyes flickered, the way they used to when he was a boy caught in a lie. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll get to the point. Maddie's been saying things, serious things that could hurt people. I think you know what I'm talking about." Maddie stepped into the doorway behind me before I could respond. "You mean the truth," she said, her voice sharp. Greg's jaw tightened. "Maddie, you're young. You don't understand what damage this could do to the family." "The family," he shot back. "Or your precious image." His nostrils flared, but he kept his voice even. "This is about keeping the past in the past. About moving forward without dredging things up." I stepped fully into the doorway, blocking his view of Maddie. "The past," I said slowly, "isn't in the past when it's still hurting people. And it's not dredging if it's the truth." Greg's eyes narrowed. "Mom, I don't think you realize what you're risking here. If Maddie starts spreading stories." "They're not stories," I cut in. His voice dropped. "You think you're helping her, but you're making her a target. You know what people will say about a girl making accusations like that? They'll say she's lying for attention. Just like they said about me," I said, my voice cutting through his. He blinked. "What?" I took a deep breath. "Greg, I know what happened to Maddie because it happened to me. Almost exactly the same way. Same kind of man. Same kind of silence." For the first time all evening, he looked truly thrown. "That's you never." "Of course I never," I said. "Because when I tried to tell my mother, she told me not to start trouble. And I spent 60 years carrying something that should have been dragged into the light. I'm not letting Maddie carry hers alone." His hand tightened on the folder until the cardboard creaked. "Mom, this could destroy people's lives." "It should," I said. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, setting them carefully on the porch railing. "These are statements," he said. "From people in town. People who'll say you've been confused lately. That Maddie's been influenced by you." Maddie let out a sharp gasp behind me. "You're planning to discredit us," I said flatly. "I'm planning to protect the family," he said, though there was no conviction in it. "No," I said. "You're planning to protect the man who hurt her. And yourself, because admitting this happened would mean admitting you didn't protect your own daughter." That one landed. He flinched. The rain was steady now, filling the silence between us. I realized something then. That Greg hadn't come here to negotiate. He'd come to warn me. He thought if he scared me enough, I'd convince Maddie to back down. But what he didn't know was that the moment I saw that folder, I'd already decided something. I was done playing defense. "Greg," I said quietly, "do you remember the summer of 1983? When you broke your arm falling out of that tree?" He blinked at the shift in topic. "Of course. Do you remember who stayed up all night with you in the hospital while your father went home to get some rest?" His gaze faltered. "You did. And do you remember who worked double shifts for 3 months to pay the medical bills because the insurance didn't cover it all?" His jaw worked. "You." "Right," I said. "I did those things because I loved you. Because you were my child and protecting you was my first duty. And now I'm doing the same thing for Maddie. Even if it means protecting her from her own uncle." I stepped forward, closing the space between us, and took the folder from the railing. He didn't stop me. "You think this is your weapon," I said, flipping it open. "But this is paper. I've got photographs. I've got journals. I've got witnesses who've been quiet for decades. And I've got a granddaughter who's not afraid to speak. Do you really want to go to war with that?" For a moment I saw him waver. Then his mouth tightened again. "You're making a mistake." No, I said, stepping back into the doorway. I'm correcting one. And then I shut the door in his face. Maddie exhaled shakily. Grandma, what are we going to do? I set the folder down on the kitchen table and met her eyes. We're going to gather everything. Every scrap of proof. Every detail they thought we'd forgotten. And when we're ready, we're going to show it to the people who can't be bought or silenced. She swallowed. You mean? Yes, I said. Reporters. Lawyers. Anyone who'll listen. If they want to play this in the public eye, we'll make sure it's under the brightest light possible. Maddie nodded slowly, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something in her expression that looked like hope. But outside, through the rain-speckled window, I saw Greg still standing by his car, staring at the house. And I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He thought he could scare us into silence. He thought we'd fold like we always had. But now we were building a case they couldn't outrun. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid. Fear had long since burned into something sharper. But because my mind wouldn't stop calculating. At 2:17 in the morning, I was still at the kitchen table, the folder Greg brought lying open in front of me. It wasn't much, typed statements, all nearly identical in tone, full of vague remarks about concern for my mental state. The kind of thing meant to sound reasonable in a courtroom or a closed-door meeting. But I knew what they were. Character assassination in polite language. And polite language has always been the weapon of cowards. Maddie padded in, hair mussed from tossing in bed. You're still up. I'm making a list, I said without looking up. A list of what? People who can't be swayed by Greg, I said. People who've seen enough of the truth to recognize it when it's spoken aloud. She sat across from me, pulling her knees up under her chin. Do you really think we'll find enough? I met her eyes. Oh, Maddie. I think we'll find more than enough. We just have to be willing to dig. The first crack came quicker than I expected. 2 days later, I was in line at the grocery store when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find Cheryl Rollins, a woman I'd known for years, her face pale. Vera, she said, lowering her voice. I need to talk to you. Not here. We ended up in her car in the far corner of the parking lot, windows fogged from the cold. She twisted her hands in her lap before speaking. I heard what's going around, she said. About you and Maddie. Greg's been telling people things. I'm sure he has, I said. Her eyes darted to mine. But here's the thing. He came to me last week, asked me to sign one of those statements. Said it was just to vouch for his character. But the way it was worded, it didn't sit right with me. I didn't sign. Something loosened in my chest. Why are you telling me this? Because, she said, voice trembling. I know what Maddie's talking about. I had my own, when I was a girl. And I wish someone had stood beside me the way you're standing beside her now. We sat there for a long moment, the car silent except for the ticking of the cooling engine. Then Cheryl reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is a letter I wrote years ago. Never showed anyone. But if it helps you, I want you to have it. I took it, my fingers brushing hers. Cheryl, you don't know what this means. She smiled sadly. I do. That's why I'm here. When I told Maddie later, she looked at me like I'd just pulled sunlight out of a gray sky. You think there's more? She asked. I don't think, I said. I know. And I was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the ripple spread. Quiet phone calls, knocks at the back door after dark. A retired teacher who remembered a certain man's habit of volunteering for late-night chaperone duty. A former neighbor who'd once walked in on a conversation that made her skin crawl. Most had never spoken, some had tried and been shut down, but all of them understood exactly why we were doing this. For the first time I could see Greg's control slipping, not because we'd made a public scene, but because truth was moving under the surface, person to person, in whispers he couldn't track or stop. The final crack came the following weekend, and it was Greg himself who caused it. He'd been quiet for days, and I knew it wasn't because he'd surrendered. He was regrouping. That's what men like him do. They retreat, reframe, and come back thinking they can still win. But instead of some grand attack, he made a mistake. He cornered Maddie outside her part-time job, where one of her friends happened to be recording a silly video for social media. The audio caught everything. Greg telling Maddie she was ruining the family for attention, mocking her teenage dramatics, and then the part that spread like wildfire. You think Grandma's a saint. She's just bitter because nobody believed her sob story either. By nightfall, half the town had heard it. And for every person who bought his version, there were two who didn't. People had seen too much, heard too much. And his own voice had become our best witness. When I sat on the porch that evening, the scrapbook in my lap and Cheryl's letter beside me, I realized we weren't just holding evidence anymore. We were holding the truth in a way they couldn't bury. But the next move had to be careful. One wrong step and they'd spin it all back into shadows. Maddie came out and sat beside me. So, what now? I looked at her. The porch light casting her face half in gold, half in shadow. Now, I said, we stop whispering. We make them hear us in places they can't shut down. She smiled faintly, though I saw the nerves in her eyes. And if they come after us? I closed the scrapbook and held it tight. Then they'll learn something I wish I'd known when I was your age. What's that? That the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman with nothing left to fear. We had the proof. We had the witnesses. And we had their own words turning against them. The morning of the Community Awards banquet was brisk and bright, the kind of fall day where the air feels sharper than it should, where even the sunlight carries an edge. Greg was set to receive some outstanding citizen plaque for his volunteer work with youth sports. Ironic, really, given what I knew. And that irony was exactly why I chose it as the place to strike. By then, Maddie and I had everything lined up. The scrapbook, the old letter, Cheryl's statement, the other quiet testimonies. And most damning of all, the video of Greg cornering Maddie. That last piece was still bouncing around online, gathering sympathy and outrage in equal measure. But going public wasn't just about showing evidence. It was about reclaiming the story, making sure my voice and Maddie's were the loudest in the room. Maddie and I arrived early. I wore my Sunday best, a deep green dress that had been gathering dust for a decade, my hair pinned the way I used to for church. People underestimate how much presentation matters. If you want them to listen, first you make them look. As the hall filled, I watched Greg work the crowd. He was all smiles, leaning down to shake hands, clasping shoulders, speaking in that false polite tone that had charmed people for years. But his eyes caught mine, just for a moment, and the smile flickered. He knew I wasn't here just to clap politely. They called his name midway through the evening. He walked up to the podium, shaking hands with the mayor, accepting the plaque like it was his birthright. He launched into his speech. All about community values, building trust, mentoring the next generation. Every word a jab in the ribs, daring me to stay quiet. And that's when I stood up. At first, people just glanced over, assuming maybe I was heading to the restroom. But I walked straight down the aisle, past the tables, up toward the stage. Greg faltered mid-sentence. Mom is there. Don't, I said, my voice carrying farther than I thought possible. Don't call me that like you mean it. The room went still. I took the microphone from its stand. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. I wasn't going to speak tonight, I began, scanning the crowd. But I think if we're giving out awards for integrity, people deserve to know the whole story. A murmur rippled through the audience. I pulled out Cheryl's letter next. And while we're talking about integrity, when my granddaughter came to me with her own story, I believed her. Because I'd lived my own 60 years ago, in the same house where Greg grew up. I stayed silent back then because no one wanted to hear it. People told me I'd ruin the family. That I should move on. I let my eyes sweep the crowd. Silence doesn't heal. It festers. And if you don't stop it, it finds another victim. My granddaughter is proof of that. She came to me because she thought I would understand. And I did. I reached for the last piece. The phone Maddie had given me, the video queued up and ready. If you still doubt us, you can listen to his own words. I tapped the screen and his voice filled the hall, dripping with contempt. You think Grandma's a saint? She's just bitter because nobody believed her sob story either. It was over the moment that clip ended. The applause didn't come right away. First there was just silence, thick, heavy, suffocating. Then a few people stood, clapping slowly. And more. Until the sound filled the space so completely I could feel it in my bones. Greg stayed frozen, his plaque dangling awkwardly from one hand. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Afterward, people approached me in waves. Some hugged me. Some whispered their own stories in my ear. A few just squeezed my hand, their eyes saying what their mouths couldn't. Maddie found me in the crowd, tears running freely down her face. You did it, she whispered. No, I said, pulling her into my arms. We did it. In the weeks that followed, Greg faded from the public eye, stepped down from his volunteer positions, stopped showing up at community events. His supporters either fell silent or drifted away, unwilling to defend him now that the truth was out in the open. As for me, well, I didn't just go back to life as it was. I rebuilt it. I started a local support group for survivors, young and old. I reopened my sewing shop part-time, not because I needed the money, but because it gave me joy. And I took Maddie on a trip to the coast. Her first time seeing the ocean. One evening, as we stood on the pier watching the waves, she asked, "Do you think it's over?" I thought about it for a long moment. The worst of it is. But stories like ours, they don't really end. They just get handed to the next person, in the hope they'll feel less alone. And maybe that's the real comeback. Not just proving your enemies wrong, but using the truth they tried to bury to plant something new. Something that will keep growing long after they've been forgotten. That's what Maddie and I built together. And if I'm lucky, it'll stand longer than any award Greg ever had his name on. If you've stayed with me until now, you know this wasn't just about winning. It was about taking back our voices, our dignity, and our place in the story. Maddie and I didn't just survive. We made sure the silence stopped with us. Make sure you hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories that prove it's never too late to stand up and be heard.